Good evening, everybody. My name is Elle Palmer. I am the author of the Pippington Tales, which is like if you took the setting of Downton Abbey and mixed in fairy tale magic. So I like the series. Hopefully you will too. Um, so we're here for editing poetry. And give our awesome panelists a chance. You can applaud as loud as you want at home for each of our panelists as they introduce themselves and tell us a little bit about their work. Why don't we start with Daniel?
All right. I'm Daniel Cureton. I'm a poet and I also edit poetry. My book is back there on the shelf, Monster Brain. And I have various poems in different collections, and I've created various collections for authors and done various things with poetry in literary journals. And so I find myself steeped in that language art often enough that I said, okay, this is a career for me. So, yeah, I graduated from Weber State University with my master's in English in 2017 and have been kind of sailing forward ever since in the art of poetry.
Cool. Todd?
I'm Michael Todd Gallowglas. I publish fiction and nerdy poetry under the nom de plume M. Todd Gallowglas. My more mainstream poetry I publish under Michael Gallowglas. I am a traditional Irish storyteller, author. I have many books of fiction out, a couple of non-fiction things, and 2 books of gaming poetry with more on the way. I have a BA in English with a focus on creative writing from San Francisco State University. I have a Master of Fine Arts in Fiction from Sierra Nevada University. I am currently pursuing my Master of Fine Arts in Poetry from Sierra Nevada University on my way to my PhD because I think Dr. Gallowglas sounds really cool.
That does sound really cool.
It does.
And yes, I have a list of people that's Dr. Gallowglas to you.
Yeah.
Do you prefer being called Michael or Todd?
I don't have a preference. Okay. Most people just call me Gallowglas, so.
Okay, we can do that too.
Sounds good.
And Michael.
Yes, other Michael. There's never a shortage of Michaels around, right?
Well, since there's another Michael, I'll be Todd today.
That sounds great. You can be Todd. Yeah, I'm Michael D. Young. I've done all sorts of things with my poetry. I've done a lot of religious poetry and songwriting. Is a lot of my focus. I have several podcasts in which I use my poetry in different settings. I've also done novel length fiction. I've done some. My latest release was called The Hunger, and I'm releasing a couple more. The other 2 books in that trilogy this year, mostly fantasy, science fiction sort of stuff, and then religious poetry, or inspirational too, I guess you could say, religious inspirational sort of genre.
Excellent. So first question, we'll talk about self-editing your own poetry. So you've written your poem. What are kind of the steps and tips you guys have for when you've written your first draft of your poem? What are you looking for when you're doing that self-editing stage?
Yeah, I mean, the very first thing I do is just I get somewhere where I can just read it aloud, very in as if I'm reading it to an audience, and really seeing where I stumble, because that often indicates, hey, I goofed the meter right there, or that really didn't flow. Just really getting it more than just like looking at it on the page, but like performing it for myself so that I can feel where the rough patches are. I guess that's the first thing I do.
I look for stuff that doesn't work. I usually write out the first draft and let it rest for a while, a few days, maybe a week or 2, and then I come back to it and go, okay, it's to me at that point really evident what's missing or what didn't work, because I usually am writing with a narrative in mind or a topic, so it's not just kind of spinning my wheels and going, I'm not sure. I usually already have a definite idea if I put down a first draft. And so by coming back fresh, I can go, oh, okay, I need to fill stuff in. I need to expand this section. These words aren't working at all. This is the meter, the rhyme scheme I didn't want, So that's when I come back to do all the sort of main changes, I think.
So I look at two elements of the poem when I come back to it to go, okay, I'm going to re-explore this thing. The first is I look at what my lines are doing. For those of you who are here kind of coming into poetry maybe from fiction, because this is largely a fiction writing conference, the basic unit of construction in fiction is the sentence, whereas in poetry it's the line. And so you really want to make sure that that what you're doing on the lines is each one is I look at how can I make each one of my lines sort of its own mini poem above and beyond the sentence structure of it, if I am even using sentence structure. The other thing that I look at is I look at if the poem is actually about the thing that I originally wrote it about, because what there's this thing called the triggering idea, right? When I sat down to write this poem, I was writing it about the thing. So say I was writing it about, for one, I'm just arbitrarily off the top of my head, for a gaming poem, that how much it sucks to make a critical failure in the big boss fight at the end of the campaign and the total party wipes, right?
Yeah.
And so that's what the initial subject of the poem is. But then maybe there's something toward about the halfway point on that is like, oh no, that initial subject was the entry point, but the poem is really about this other thing. So what's under the surface of that first initial triggering idea for the poem that I'm like, no, this is get rid of that other thing. And there's this other artifact that I've got. I sort of have my archaeologist toothbrushes and stuff. That's the thing that the poem really wants to be about. And usually I get that by looking at the individual lines, which will then, as I'm going through, that will give me the real subject of the poem, as opposed to the thing that got me into it in the first place. When it's really good is when I take them both and I play them off of each other, but I'm still working on doing that.
I find sometimes you can actually, I can split off, hey, that initial idea, I'm going to make something else out of that. And I find I'd go back to that later and still develop that later. But you have to decide, whether you still have your original vision all the way through.
Right. I agree with the line part as well. I've seen a lot of poetry where the authors were doing something really good in a stanza, but their line breaking was really off. And what I mean by that is that where the natural conclusion of a line is, they've added another word like what or of or it as a continuation. Inward into the continuation that it actually should be dropped down to the next line.
Right.
And it doesn't really work very well, but they may not be able to see it because they're thinking of a way to bridge it to the next line. But really, it does its job by itself. If you just,
the end words are vital.
Yeah. So once you get a great end word on there and you just move it down, it's fine. Nobody's going to notice otherwise. That they're all doing their job in a row. So I've noticed that's a thing a lot in poetry where people aren't really thinking about, necessarily that connection between the lines.
Yeah, and it's interesting how you say you can think about the end word before you think about the first word. That's another thing that you kind of have to shift your thinking on that. If you're a novelist, you write sentences in order, right? But as a poet, sometimes you really like, okay, I need it to end on this word or this phrase or whatever, and you can work in a different order than you would as a typical prose.
Right.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. That's something that I find is kind of liberating about poetry in whatever format you do, because there's so many different types of formats in poetry, the forms from free verse to traditional stanza, haikus, and all that. That you can approach it in any of these avenues, like a entry point into the poem itself. If you want to start with the inward to build off of that, or do you want to start traditionally at the beginning of a sentence with it, or are you dropping in somehow? Yeah.
And so when you're editing someone else's work, so now moving to you're editing someone else's poem, how are you working to edit that? What does that process look like?
I think it's pretty much the same process. For me, at least, I try to be as good as a self-critic as I would for others, if not more critical of my own work. But so I take that initial pass at it, the read through, and then I kind of work off of these were the initial things that really stood out at first. Like right away, I could tell needed to be changed, whether that's moving words around or if it's a rhyming poem and that it's not really working very well, or they're missing part of their narrative. So like it ends really weakly and it needs to be expanded between like a line or a stanza. They need to add more in. So that's how I approach it, and then it just refine it from there.
Yeah, I often look to see if I can tell if it's obvious what the structure they meant to go with is. Like, so if I read through them, like, okay, they're trying to go with this kind of structure or poem, and if I can tell that right away, to make sure that it's consistently applied. I mean, that's one of the big things that I look for. Of course, my own, like, hey, I meant to go with this particular meter. And so, is that obvious to me? Does that seem like they're trying to fit this into this sort of framework, or is it not? And is that intentional? And did they try and fail to do it, or is it supposed to be more free flowing? That sort of thing.
That's true. I forgot. Thank you for. I had sort of that in my mind, and I didn't say it.
Oh, no, you're
yeah,
good.
that's
You're
true.
good.
Yeah. Fitting it within that structure and style. And I've had that happen where people told me they were doing a specific style, and I'm like, that's not written in that style. I'm sorry. No matter what you say, this doesn't fit the format of that style over here. So, okay, it's a conversation.
No, that's not really a sestina.
Yeah, right. There's a really specific thing that defines a sestina or another type of poetry.
You did not do that thing.
Yeah, so in that case, it's like it's not. You need to change it, or we call it something else. But
then we just make it a teaching moment. Okay, now if you wanted to do that, here's what you got to do.
How do you approach it, Todd?
The only editing of poetry that I do for other people is in my grad school classes, and because I'm so in many ways brand new to poetry, and one of my mentors this semester has been telling me, "Oh, you're doing great. You're like your lines, and you're really progressing." And the director of my program recently told me that I was going, my progress was going way faster than he thought it was going to, because coming from fiction, all my life fiction, then because one of my teachers during my fiction MFA sunk her fangs into me and dragged me screaming into poetry. But now I'm really happy because I'm doing some really cool, interesting things with stuff that some of my teachers have never seen anybody do before. And I was like, hey, I'm not spending $10,000 a semester here to F around. Like, right. So, but it, like, when I go into the workshops with my fellow poets at school, it's one of those things like, I'm going to be quiet and listen to you guys talk and pick out the things that you guys are saying that are really smart and figure out how to do that in my stuff before I tell you guys how to do your thing. Right. I'm like, I'll totally rip somebody's fiction apart because that's my area of expertise. Kindly, because I do that with my students and everything like that. But I don't really edit other people's poetry. I ask questions. Like, I ask the questions that I would ask my teachers. if I'm looking at somebody's and I don't get something, I would go, "What are you doing here? Why is this? What? Tell me." Like I ask the questions of why is this way, because I'm wondering what I'm supposed to take away from my own poetry out of this.
Yeah.
I think it's easy to get stuck in a place where you don't want to edit it because it seems like an art form that you are destroying if you attempt to.
Oh,
But I was that vicious person in graduate school that tore apart people's poetry. I was the person in the class who said, "This is a piece of, why did you bring this to class today? I don't."
That was me in fiction.
Yeah, that's right. And I did it from a place of sincerity because I wanted them to be better.
Right.
And also, after like 3 months, I was tired of reading basically the same poem with different names. So kind of that approach. But yeah, I think it's easy to, and I've noticed in my experience, it's easy to not want to really go down the grind mill with editing a poem because you think, oh, this is something beautiful. But I think that process of editing polishes it and makes it even more beautiful as a piece of craft. And so we have to move away from the idea like, well, this is sacred or this is really inspirational. The way it is, I can't edit it.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I've got a quick experience about kind of that same thing that I went through. It's 2018, and I'd written a text that I wanted to be set to music, and I collaborated with this fellow who was very, very particular. I won't go through the whole thing, but long story short, I worked on this text with him for 6 months straight. It was just on email, back and forth. This little thing here, this little thing there. And sometimes I really just wanted to scream, like, really? Like, what else did you find? What else could you have possibly found here?
Mm-hmm.
But I found it was such a great learning experience. I think from that one simple text and drilling down so hard into that one text, it felt like taking a master class because he really did. It really made me dig down deep and say, okay, we got to get rid of the filler words. We got to make the rhymes, but we want it to say exactly what you want it to say. The meter's got to be perfect. We want the parallelism between the verses because it's a song. Just every the punctuation, even every minute detail. I feel like it really was a gauntlet. But then when it came out afterwards, I was like, okay, that really was actually super helpful. I don't want to do that with every single thing that I ever write, of course, or you never get anything done. But as a teaching moment, I find that there really is a lot of worth of taking something that you really are passionate about, I really wanted to polish this till it shines, and investing that time and getting somebody who is knowledgeable about that, who's willing to be brutally honest and help you to polish it till it's something that you're really, really happy with. Yeah, and I was at the end actually. I was like, "Oh wow, it really is amazing. They're like amazingly better than it used to be."
I think one thing that I think will help, especially the audience for this conference, is what can you say is kind of the difference in editing and developing poetry than it is with fiction?
So, when you're going back into a poem, one of the challenges of poetry, because there's so many different forms, especially when you're using quote unquote free verse. Free verse doesn't mean you just get to do what you want.
Yeah.
Free verse means that you are creating the structure of the poem every time you sit down to write a free verse poem. So if you write a haiku, everybody knows what a haiku is. If you're going to write a sonnet, that form is static. If you're going to write a pontoon, or you're going to write a sestina or whatever. But when you're writing free verse, part of the editing process is then you are teaching the reader how to read that poem. Right? And so one of my big learning moments was I met and fell head over heels, Twitter-pated with the lady, and I wrote her a poem And then I submitted the poem to my mentor last semester, and he said, "Yeah, this is much. This is a little much." And I was like, "Yeah, I know, but I wanted let's use this." And so he goes, "Okay, so what I want you to do is I want you to take this really long poem. It's over 1,000 words, and
That's a
yeah,
lot of poem.
and he says, and turn it into a sestina."
Oh,
So a
Oh my
sestina has 6.5 stanzas, and the end words, they're not rhymes. The end words on the lines, they don't rhyme, but they stay the same throughout, but they shift places through the poem. Right?
yeah.
It's really, really challenging. And so I started working on it, and I sent him an email for my first packet. I said, "I'm still working on the sestina. It's just not coming the way I want it to, because I was trying to make the sestina perfect." Right, I was trying to do a perfect sestina. My first time out writing a sestina, which I should have known. No, this is so. What he says is, okay, don't write a great sestina. Now write 3 bad sestinas.
Yeah.
And so I wrote the 3 bad sestinas, and the third one, he said, "Oh, this is actually pretty good." And then I went back to the poem, the original poem, and I didn't write it as a sestina, but the sestina helped me focus so that I moved stuff around. I paid more attention to the lines. What were what based on the words? Because he says, from the end words, take the 6 words that you think are really the thematic essence of the poem. And I tried to use different end words each time I went through the sestina. And they were all different for the first one and the second one, and there were some repeats in the third one. But it really helped me go back into this really kind of monstrosity of a poem, and really kind of, oh, this is what I want to do with the lines. This is where the stanzas are going to be. This is what I'm going to actually have in each stanza, so that each stanza becomes its own like little mini poem, but then it creates a narrative arc rather than just wandering all over the place. So I'm now, when I go back and revisit it again, I'm going to go back to it with the eye of, okay, now how am I going to teach the reader how to read this poem while they're reading it? And that's one of the things. But it's also, the difference between prose and poetry is it's not the sentence, it's the line.
Yeah.
And that's one of the first things to wrap the head around. But also that just because you're using free verse doesn't mean you can just do whatever. You've got to understand why you're making the choices in this structure that you're inventing as you're writing it.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that main difference is when there's 2 different modes for editing fiction and editing poetry. With fiction, you're focused on what? The narrative, structure, building. I mean, there's a lot of those in that part of that creative writing, and that what you need to look at. But then it becomes a whole different entity in the poetry, because it may be 1 page, it may be 10 pages, depending on the type you're using. And so you have to approach each one of them with that in mind, about the precise nature of containing it in that structure itself. Because if it's going to be, like Todd has said, a sestina, it has to have those structural components, or there's not a sestina. And that's the main difference of how do I work in that box of those stanzas and those lines versus, the manuscript of my novel. So I think that's scaling down is also the idea of getting everything packed into it. It's like writing short form fiction or flash fiction. It's a similar idea in comparison to writing poetry.
Yeah.
Compress.
That's right. That's right, because that's the most beautiful poetry is the most tight and precise, that gets the meaning across. Rambling poetry sure has its place when it's intended to be rambling, but unintentional rambling poetry where they sort of wander around is not very interesting usually, and very deemed to be very good, because it just sort of misses the mark on all the points of what makes it supposed to be the art of the language. The capturing of the inner and the outer, and packaging it for people to understand. So I think that's a critical difference too, or in editing the two types is getting your brain used to looking at those structures and the requirements in that structure.
Yeah, and just there's so many interlocking parts in when writing a poem, and it's hard because if you change one thing, it can often have a sort of an avalanche effect where you have to, it's like, oh my God, it was perfect until I changed that one word.
It's true.
It's so frustrating sometimes.
It cannot be forgiving. And I think that it just takes a lot of practice when you're doing it. In those, if you're doing like these really tight structures, it does take practice to really get it good because of how unforgiving they are. And that's why I think, sorry, I was going to say, I think that's why some people might tend to free verse more, is because they don't want to feel confined. Mm-hmm. But I think even in the free verse, there is that expectation that it's not going to be just a rambling stream of consciousness, Yeah.
Or unless that's prose, right?
Yeah, unless that's prose, right? So, yeah.
The challenge to the free verse is you have to be brave enough to create your own confinement.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, I've done plenty of free verse myself. I love it. I love Walt Whitman, the father of free verse.
Yeah.
I tend to use free verse as narrative poetry. So
totally. It's
if I'm really feeling something, then I have like 8 pages and I'll plot it down as a free verse. Like I did a very long poem about this Marjorie Stoneman Douglas school shooting. It was free verse narrative, and I had one published in Adelaide magazine, literary magazine, last year about the Brazil National Museum fire a couple of years ago when that National Museum was destroyed. And so that was another long, because there was so much packed into that. 90% of their collections were destroyed by fire. It was like a lobotomy of human society. And so there was so much I felt in that, because my day job is I am an archivist. And so highly personal in those ways. Yeah, I had never been there, but it was still like, in your profession. And so it was really, so the amount of energy I brought to that could only have been expressed in that free verse. It would have been too confining in like a villanelle or pantoum or something.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. I do less free verse because I am focused so much as a musician, composer, sort of. I write a lot of my poetry with that end. But yeah, sometimes it is just, it's maddening if you're locked into a particular. So you got to find something that fits the rhyme, but it also has to fit the meter at the same time, and it can't be too similar to something you've already used unless you're trying to do that on purpose. I mean, there are so many things to think about.
Mm-hmm.
In that. So I guess that a good thing to think even before you even start out on it is to really take a good long look at that and see which of these forms is going to serve my message best.
Yes, absolutely.
Speaking to the forms and everything, I've really gotten into Ursula K. Le Guin's poetry.
Oh yeah, that's good.
Okay, yeah.
She's and she does a lot of different forms and structures. And none of her poetry is genre stuff. She writes a lot of nature poetry. She did her own version of the Tao Te Ching, not speaking Chinese, but just trying to come up with her own poetic language. But she, in one of the introductions to one of the books of hers that I have, talks about structure. The structure engenders creativity and imagination, because you have to take the idea that you have, if you're going to put it into a specific structure, you have to warp the idea and work the idea and play with it so that because the best structured poems are the ones where people forget they're reading a structure.
Yeah.
They lose themselves in the language that you're using, right? But the other thing that the structures are really good for, and this is something that I'm working with this semester with one of my mentors. We're writing poetry into some of my traumas and my mental health issues. And one of the things that we're doing is, if there's something that's there's a subject that's really challenging for me, that I'm like, oh, I don't know that I want to go into this, is using poetic structures, because I'm so focused on fitting to the structure, so that it allows for an easier entry point into the subject of myself that I'm writing about, so that it eases me into that. And the end poem isn't going to necessarily be the structured poem.
Mhm.
I might on future drafts might totally get rid of the structure, but the structure is there to kind of distract me into the thing, rather than the thing being front and center in my mind, especially if it's super triggering for me. And some of the stuff that I'm writing about absolutely is. And so one of the things that she has had me do is make up my own weird arbitrary structures, which then I've taken to workshops where I teach people to write, or get people writing poetry in their own fantastical universes. I said, okay, take a culture and figure out how they make up the structure.
That's a pretty smart idea. Yeah.
And I
That's
firmly
awesome.
believe that all the super hard, weird poetry structures that we have came from poets hanging out in bars and getting drunk and saying, I bet you can't write something like this.
Oh yeah.
And then the thing is it's not the ones that they did brilliant work on that stuck. It's the one where they did one that was kind of okay, and the other poet said, oh, I can totally do better than that. And that's the ones that we still have. Those are the ones that we still have.
Yeah.
Well, that's
Sestina's what?
reminds me of different improv games where like you have to come up with the last two lines of the thing, and they have to rhyme with the last word of the person before you said.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, that's totally a poetry game.
Yeah.
Nice.
And then and also a lot of what you guys are describing reminds me of what somebody else said earlier today in a different panel on different genres. Is there's a lot of creativity in structure. Structure allows a lot of creativity because you have, okay, there's a structure, now how do I fit the puzzle of this structure? And that's what I'm hearing from all three of you.
It's interesting though, like you have to also think, how can I fit it in? But how can I also fit it in a way that it can be decoded by others? Like it doesn't matter, like, hey, that technically works, but if it's not comprehensible, other people can unpack it. Still not as effective. So I mean, there's just a lot to think about it. There's a lot more that goes into it, and you might see at first glance.
Each word is very valuable in poetry.
Oh yeah.
I think that's really fascinating about the format.
And it's really important. I think sometimes as a poet, you get crop up these filler words. You're like, okay, I need one more syllable right there. I'm just going to throw in it's just something to make the meter work. And that's some of the hardest conversations you have to have is, how can I still fit that in, but get rid of the filler. There's rid of the something that doesn't really contribute anything other than just being another syllable, right? So.
Right.
Just 1 second. Cat needs out. Pardon me.
Yeah, you're good. You're good.
Yeah.
At least you don't have the cat filter. Did you see that one?
Oh, man, that has been everywhere.
I'm a lawyer, not a cat.
I'm not a cat.
Already classic.
Oh man. Stories of our day, right?
Thank you. It's one of those deals, Cats.
Yeah.
How I love cats. And they eat all the rats. No, just kidding. We're not going to go the dime poetry,
Dr. Seuss has entered the building.
Yeah.
All right.
Things I think is important to be a good editor. If anything, they say you got to be a good reader, and it's definitely true in poetry.
Definitely.
Because you get exposure to the different structures and forms in poetry, but also it generates ideas. When you read amazing poets and you read unknown poetry by famous authors like Ursula K. Le Guin, how many people knew she had a book of poetry?
Oh, many books of poetry.
Yeah, many books. or Tupac. He had poetry,
Yeah.
and it's like I think it really, if you're on a quest to being an editor in poetry, you need to be as well read as you can be in the different people, not just the famous ones. But I love, I love to do. I love to go to the local thrift shop, Savers, and shop around the book section for chapbooks. And I have found some really great ones and some not so great ones, but some really great poets in there who had chapbooks, and they may not have been famous, but their writing was amazing because they were writing sincerely about it, what they were experiencing. And one guy was a miner in the 60s, and like a coal miner or something, and just wrote about his life, and it was amazing stuff. So I think that's also a really great exercise I do for me to discover people and to read stuff I might not have otherwise have written or read or known about, like cowboy poetry. So.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
It's important, even like as a regular author of fiction, it's important to know the tropes of your genre. And if you're not well read, you're going to think like, "Wow, I'm being so groundbreaking," when it's actually.
Well,
that's
the thing that I tell all of my fiction students, and this applies absolutely to poetry as well, is you're incapable of writing a story better than the best story that you've read, whether it's a novel or short story or whatever medium that you're incapable of writing a story better than the best story that you read in the last 6 to 12 months. And it's absolutely true of poetry. Absolutely true of poetry. If you're not reading some of the absolute best poetry that's been written, your poetry isn't going to be the best that it can be, because we write to the models that we ingest.
Absolutely.
Across whatever medium. If you're writing essays, if you're writing criticism, you're writing fiction, you're writing screenplays, you need to read the thing that you want to write, because you're going to learn. That's primarily how we learn. We ingest these models, and then we take those and we take all the different examples of the models and mush them together, and then finally start bringing our own voice to it.
And I'd say read widely across time and space. Don't just stick with 19th century American or European, but go into Persian or go into Russian in 19th century, or go into 9th century Tang dynasty, or Hebrew. It doesn't matter. The more exposure, the more latitude you get with those, the better. It can only enhance your ability to understand poetry, to appreciate it as the art it is through time, and to then understand what your approach is to why you want to be an editor of poetry or write poetry too. So, because I think we have a fair amount of more poetry historically, I've noticed, than fiction writing. Novels, are kind of more recent to the scene than poetry and temple hymns.
Novels a baby art form.
Yeah.
Right?
Look, because the earliest known poet was some of the Sumerians, 4,000 BC, and we have their temple hymns, and they're considered priestesses in their temples, like Enheduanna. And so it's amazing that humanity was writing at least 6,000 years ago what's considered poetry. It's that old. And so we're very fortunate that we still have access to 6,000-year-old poems and 5,000, and it's just amazing. Why not consume it?
I love your passion for this. So I'm going to get to some. I think that's fantastic.
Thank you.
Poetry,
I'm a weird nerd. That's what people usually say.
I think it's fantastic, especially when I love a good panel that I'm moderating is that I don't have to do much because the panelists are just so passionate about them. And I think that's fantastic. I'm going to get to some of the reader questions. First is a business question.
Okay.
Is one, how do you find clients for editing poetry, or is there a freelance poetry editing market? And then how do you bill for that poetry? So that's kind of a business question.
Sure.
Do we have an answer? Any of you know?
I talked, so I'm waiting to see.
Oh,
Yeah,
I don't professionally edit poetry, so I don't have an answer for that.
I don't do it professionally. I help out other poets that I know. We often just swap work and give each other feedback, but I don't do it professionally.
Okay, I'm the one who does.
Nice.
So
Let us know.
yeah, it's pretty much the same as other editing model types, except for the way you set up how you're charging by. So are you charging per word or per line, per poem, that kind of deal? Instead of in a manuscript format like a novel, if you're charging per page or something, that you wouldn't charge per word in a novel.
Well, you do charge per word, but it's like 0.00.
Yeah, a fraction of a cent. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. So, that's how I kind of regulate too. If somebody has one poem they want work on, then that's sort of just a project, one-off job. It's whatever rate, $50, $200, that whatever. It's really small. And then versus, and you could do by the word in that case. And so it really saves them a lot of money. It's part of that negotiation of, well, what do you want? Here's what I can offer. My skill sets. What are you looking to get out of this editing process? And then if somebody approaches you with a collection of like a manuscript of like 50 poems, then that's when you start getting into, okay, per hour probably, or per line. It depends on that manuscript. So I think there's a lot of flexibility in what you feel comfortable with. Charging people as a rate. Is it per hour or is it per word you're charging? And I think what's fair to them too, because we want to get paid, right? We have time, or valuable time and stuff, but I think it's also a lot of it is building network and communicating with people. And I think that's a way also to find clients, is showing up to conferences and making connections with people, friendships, and they say, oh, I don't edit poetry, but I know a guy who does, and they refer you. So I know that sounds repetitive because I've probably heard that before at other conventions, but it really is about the network of people you have too, because we don't exist in a solitary universe.
That leads us to another question, which is, where are there groups such as critique groups? How do you find groups if you're not in an MA program like some people?
I don't have to pay the loans back until I'm out of school, so I'm just going to stay in school forever. They can take it from my corpse. Well, so somebody asked about Twitter handles. Poetry Twitter is thriving. Like, look for the hashtag poets and poetry. There's a huge thriving poetry community on Twitter, and a lot of a lot of them are very, very open and very, very welcoming. You're going to get some of those snooty people that, oh, I'm a poet, but especially with the rise of slam poetry and the street poetry stuff that's been coming out over the last 10, 20 years, there's a huge open arms. Hey, come check this thing out. Come try this. Here's who I'm reading. Just use the hashtags poet and poetry, and you'll meet people. You'll hang out. And you can look and also do a search for virtual online poetry readings. And go hang out for some of those and sign up to read at a virtual open mic. Yeah.
And when we return to the normal universe, I would say that there's in-person poetry events around usually. Instead of being virtual, they'll be like at a coffee shop or at a bookstore. We'll be hosting bookstores locally. I've seen a lot like to do author events where they have a poet come in and read, and then I've done things with different magazines and zines, and they've hosted events where they don't maybe not accept your poetry. You didn't get in, you got rejected, but you're invited to come read at open mic. I've seen Facebook groups, and Meetup.com has different stuff. So I think if you search around, there's always an avenue. It's always an avenue.
So, and I know if any of you know J-Rod, who's another poet that hangs out at LTUE from the Utah area. I'm in Northern California, but we're gonna once events start going live again, we're gonna start having secret poetry slam nights where people can come and we're gonna read and throw down and have a good time. We'll find a place off the beaten path and do some nerdy poetry reading.
And I'm not a slam poet. That's definitely
no. It's not going to be a slam. You don't have to be a slam, but you should still come and read some of your poetry. Like I'm not a slam poet, and I mean J-Rod's totally a slam poet, but
respect.
I'm not.
Right?
I just drink whiskey and read my poetry.
No, in high school, I went to it was like a slam poetry thing. I didn't know what that was, and so I came up and I totally read one of my very lyrical, kind of normal mainstream things, and everyone was like, "Oh yay!" And then like kind of afterward, they I know they pulled me aside and like, "Do you know what this is?" I'm like, "Oh, I guess no." And then the next guy got up. I'm like, "Oh dear, oh man. Okay, well that's not me." Thanks though.
You can always Google local poet groups. Like in Utah, there's the Utah Poetry Society, and there's different local smaller chapters, or a writing guild if you have a writing guild in your state. Like in Utah, it's the League of Utah Writers where I live, and so there's a poetry chapter there. There's also the Poet Laureate. Currently does a poetry festival. This is in its third year. It'll be virtual this year in April. Utah Poetry Festival. So there's a number of avenues, at least in this state, for that, and I would say check out that for other states too.
Well, speaking of poet laureates, almost every large town, major city has a poet laureate. Every state has a poet laureate, and part of their duties as the poet laureate is to get more people involved in poetry. So reach out to do a Google search because we're virtual. There's a lot of there are more people that are not from the Salt Lake, Utah area, Provo area that are here. So for those of you that are watching right now or watching the replay, Google your city and state's poet laureate and see what they're doing. And if they aren't doing anything, go, hey, why aren't you doing anything? It's your job. It's part of their job description. But most of them have resources. Like I'm buddies with the most recent poet laureate of Sacramento, Indigo Moore, who he got a budget and he got facility use to run stuff.
Cool.
And he was like, I've got this money but I can only use it for this thing. So let's do stuff, guys. And we ran some really cool we ran some really cool stuff at City Hall. It was
amazing.
Howling mad fun. So yeah, jump on your poet laureates. That's part of their responsibility as being a poet laureate.
Don't literally jump on them though.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, don't do that.
Folks. So, yeah.
We've got about 2 minutes left. So first of all, Daniel and Michael, if you guys could add your we had a request for your Twitter handle. So if you have a Twitter handle or other social media that you use, I invite you to put that up on the message board for this room.
Oh, sure.
And then I like to spend the last minute or so. Let us know any other panels you might be on tomorrow, unless there's one or two more tonight. Shameless plug for anything else with the LTUE, or if you don't have anything, shameless plug for something else.
Who wants to start?
I'll go. I'm going to plug a poetry thing. For all of you poets, if you do not have The Triggering Towns by Richard Hugo, you need this book. It's a thin little book. Even if you're a fiction writer who is just started dabbling, this will make you a better fiction writer. I'm on a couple of panels tomorrow. I don't remember what, but I'm on a couple of panels. After this, I'm running a totally unauthorized, rogue BarCon via Zoom. So send me a message if you want to come and hang out at my BarCon Zoom. And I do a free writing live stream on Twitch every Tuesday night at 8 p.m. Utah time, 7 p.m. Pacific, and it's just free. You can come and watch me. This Tuesday, I'm having a conversation with Sandra Taylor. She's coming to the channel, and we're just going to talk about cultivating a creative lifestyle.
Yeah. So we're about out of time, so just keep it quick with your pitch here.
No pitch.
Oh yeah, I'll be quick then. Yeah. So I am on a couple panels tomorrow. One about religion in Brandon Sanderson's works, and another one about humor and fantasy, which I absolutely love. I just invite you. I do have a Facebook page called Books by Michael Young. It's under author Michael Young. And then I've got a couple of podcasts. I've got one. My religious one is under Chapter and Verse, and then I got another one that talks about the history of popular songs, and that's just called Songs for All Seasons. You can find those on Spotify, Apple, whatever.
No panels for me. This was my last one, and you can check out my website, danielcureton.com.
I've got 5 panels tomorrow because that's more fun that way.
Nice.
So look me up on the schedule, and you'll be able to see that tomorrow morning. I've got conflict, tension, and opposition. So about conflict in fiction.
Nice.
Yeah. And I'm not as much of an author as y'all, but eventually I will publish the dog Shakespearean monologues from the perspective of dogs that I wrote to
Sounds
my
fantastic.
sister while she was on her mission for a trip.
Yeah. That's awesome. Good luck with that.
Eventually, I have them all written. I just need to actually do something with them because I wrote them to heckle a sister.
Nice.
All right, thanks again. This was fantastic, and thanks for our active audience on the message board. It makes it a lot more fun when we can see people are really engaged. Hope everybody has a good night.